So tonight's lesson, we're going to cover exploiting wired and wireless networks. So this lesson covers exploiting network-based vulnerabilities, exploiting wireless and RF-based attacks and vulnerabilities. So cyber attacks and exploits are occurring more often. So yeah, some of these common attack vectors are going to be your network-based vulnerabilities, wireless, RF. And so you're finding a lot more wireless-related stuff. You have some of these different protocols that are used like an IoT, like Zigbee, and even Bluetooth is being attacked, Bluetooth keyboards and mice. There's some attacks where you can hijack, mouse and keyboards with different wireless devices, kind of a wireless version of some of the different Hack5 tools that you can plug in and gain access to a system. You can kind of do like mouse jacking attacks. So that's some of attack vectors that are being used out there. The network pen testing is probably one of the more common areas, and this is kind of where people get started with the wired stuff and kind of move into wireless. So, I would recommend learning wireless if you're going to be a generalist pen tester, mainly focusing on network pen testing. Then I would learn wireless. As far as Wi-Fi goes, there are some chances to exploit Bluetooth and some other protocols, but the most prevalent and most used are your wired and Wi-Fi access points. So some of the network vulnerabilities, exploits can be catastrophic. So Windows name resolution based attacks and exploits, DNS cache poisoning, attacks and exploits against server message block, SMB implementations, Snmp vulnerabilities and exploits. With Snmp, you can gain information on the system. So maybe the firewall ports are really locked down good, and you do an Nmap scan, you see filtered ports, then you may be able to pull some information with Snmp that you may not that you would normally get from some of these open ports. So you're able to do that. So you can get some pretty interesting information on the configuration in the system you're attacking through Snmp. They covered that a lot in the earlier OSCP materials, and I would imagine they still cover that. I haven't really looked at the newer materials that close. Then SMTP vulnerabilities and exploits, file transfer, FTP vulnerabilities and exploits, pass the hash attacks, man-in-the-middle attacks, Ssl stripping attacks, denial of service, and the distributed denial of service attacks. And this is one of those type of tests that companies don't do unless you ask for it. It's kind of funny working inside or just over the years dealing with customers and then internal employees when it comes to pen testing, because a lot of times you hear we don't want any denial of service tests, and usually people request that specifically. So that's not something that a pen tester will normally do unless they have permission to do that. So man-in-the-middle attacks, pass the hash, Ssl stripping attacks, okay, network access control bypass, and virtual VLAN hopping attacks. So we're going to look at exploring Windows name resolution and SMB attacks. So this is one of the most fundamental aspects of networking operating systems. There are several named IP address technologies, including Netbios, LLMNR, and DNS. So out of these, your LLMNR and Netbios are the more vulnerable and exploitable. Where used to an older operating system, older versions of Windows, they relied on Netbios and LLMNR for name resolution. So instead of just depending on DNS to resolve the names, that was like pre Windows 2000. They started kind of getting away from some of the stuff. Some of the newer versions of OS back in your NT40 in the older days, Netbios was used for name resolution. You could still use DNS, but the operating system used Netbios for name resolution. And so these are proprietary protocols. And so let's see, Netbios provides 3 different services. So you got Netbios name service for name registration and resolution, datagram service for connectionless communication, and session service for connection-oriented communication. And as we're looking through this stuff, this goes to show if you really want to, if you don't have much experience in Windows or even Linux for that fact, the more you learn these technologies, the better pen tester you're going to be. One of the things that helped me as a pen tester is my sysadmin days, understanding, working with Windows servers and Windows network environments, and some of these things I worked with on a daily basis. So that was something when I became a pen tester, I was able to jump into more of the pen testing and hacking side of things. So if you don't really understand these, then it'd be good to kind of go through and maybe take a Windows course. You may be able to find something, quick and cheap on Udemy or Pluralsight or some of the other sites. An interesting fact about learning these technologies, I've worked with some pen testers in the past that really didn't spend a lot of time on hacking courses. They would go through and get Pluralsight subscriptions so they can learn more about technology, learn about cloud, learn about different, cloud services and different new up and coming technologies in IoT, opposed to just taking hacking classes. So, if you're going to be a cloud pen tester, the more you understand cloud, the better off you are. And that's an area that would really be good to get into, because there's not really a lot of people that are, that area of the field is still kind of underfilled. So there's probably a lot more openings in that area than other areas. And you see like a good indicator of cloud being a good area to look in. All those cloud certifications, if you're AWS certified, then you can make some pretty good money just doing AWS security. Yeah, someone said, yeah, that's cloud doesn't exist. You're just using someone else's server. It's kind of funny how some of the stuff came about that really isn't all that new technology, because back in the early 2000s, they had some internet-based applications that some people used, but it really wasn't ready for prime time yet. And they didn't call it cloud then. I forget what the term was. It was like something hosted app. Forget the terminology, but back then you didn't have the high-speed internet. You didn't have all the high-speed mobile. So that's really what made cloud popular now. So, someone can work for their whole office and have high-speed internet and connect faster than we did back in the late 90s, early 2000s. So that's really what helped cloud grow. So that's a really good area to get into. So some of the Netbios related operations of use and the following ports. So TCP 135 is Microsoft Remote Procedure Call endpoint mapper for use for client to client and server to client communications. And then port 137, NetBIOS name service. Then UDP, port 138, NetBIOS datagram service. And then 139, which is NetBIOS session service. And with the newer versions of Windows, if you do away with your NetBIOS and LLMNR, then you can get by with port 445. And so that's, once you get away from that, that cuts down on some of these ports that you're having to use and cuts down on some of the vulnerabilities. So they may get into this in the content, but just right offhand, like NetBIOS and LLMNR, if that's enabled, then you have the opportunity to use a tool like Responder to intercept password hashes, because the servers are communicating and the desktops are communicating with servers. You got client to client and server communications. Then you're able to use like Responder or Invade, which is a PowerShell script that does the same thing. It captures those hashes, and you can either take those hashes and crack them using something like a hash cracker like Hashcat, or you can even do pass the hash attacks. So this is something pretty serious there. I mean, this is like, once you disable the NetBIOS and LLMNR, you're eliminating a very vulnerable protocol that is used by a lot of pen testers. A lot of pen testers, they go on site, they find this open, they run the tool, they intercept that responder information, either pass the hash or do like a relay using Responder, or pass the hash in some other way, and they got end up with domain admin in no time doing that. But so just by eliminating that, you're limiting a lot of a big area of attack for malicious actors or for people doing a pen test. So here they're talking about, so up here they tell you that this NetBIOS and SMB and LMNR, a lot of examples that they used to use Windows workgroups. So now, typically if you've got an environment set up correctly, you should be typically using the Active Directory instead of workgroups. There may be some times that you want a standalone system that you don't join a domain. Can everyone see the screen okay? Yeah. Yeah, Stephen, there must be something wrong on your end. Others can see it. It may be if you're using Mac OS, sometimes you have to set your permissions. They may not be working correctly. That's usually what I run into with sound problems with Zoom and other video conferencing software. And so here they're talking about a common vulnerability in LMNR involves an attacker spoofing authoritative sources for name resolution. This is where you use your responder. So you're able to gather these hashes, get them offline, and get the plain text passwords. So several tools can be used for this type of attack, such as MBNS spoof, Metasploit responder. Metasploit, of course, is one of the most popular tools and frameworks by pen testers and attackers. Other sources very popular is Poopy, which is available on GitHub. It's a Python cross-platform administration post-exploitation tool that works on Windows, Linux, OS X, Android. So lesson 9 penetration testing tools cover this. So the advantage, like your Metasploits, is just some of the things you can do beyond just that basic function. So if you're able to intercept, get access, there's other things you can do. So that's one of the advantages of using Metasploit over some of the other tools. And so one of the common mitigations for these type of attacks is disable LMNR in NetBIOS and in local computer settings to configure a group policy. In addition, you can configure additional network-based host access control policies to block LMNR in NetBIOS if these protocols are not needed. One of the most common detection techniques for LMNR poisoning attack is to monitor the key registry. This one registry key here for changes to the enable multicast keyword. If you see 0 for the value of the keyword, then you know LMNR is disabled. And so this is one of the ways to enable a change in that registry setting. And for those that are not familiar with group policy settings, these are settings in Active Directory. And if you're not familiar with Active Directory is a LDAP-based application that manages objects, which can be computers, I think believe in Microsoft printers as well, printers and servers, workstations, and you can set permissions so you don't have to go to each system and set those permissions. You can set it in a group policy object, so anyone that joins that domain is in a certain group, then it applies those permissions, which makes it easier to administer. Because before, at one time, you had to manually touch every machine to do that. And I remember back in those days, whenever we'd get hit by viruses and stuff, there really wasn't a good tools out there to manage multiple systems. So you had to physically go to every server and clean it, not physically, but maybe RDP to it or use some other remote connection method. So here we've got like an output from Searchploit, which we went through one day when we went over some exploitation stuff. Yeah, David said Active Directory is awesome. I use a daily reset passwords, disable, create accounts. Very useful. Yeah, back before that, back in the early NT server days, NT 4.0 and 3.51, you had to, you had to create accounts on each system, and that was a major hassle. And so now you're able to manage that universally. It's kind of interesting. A lot of people haven't heard of this, but just to kind of give you a little legacy knowledge here. Back when I was getting started in sysadmin work, Novell Network was the popular network operating system, and they had directory services before Active Directory came about. So they had directory services from like version 4X up until I think Microsoft Windows 2000 came out about the time right before, right around the time NetWare went to version 5 or so. So they had directory services for several years, and they really weren't the first one to have directory services. So directory services is just kind of a generic term of like Active Directory. So Microsoft had, or Novell had Novell Directory Services, which later became eDirectory. And then there was even an older network operating system called Banyan Vines. It's even older than that had the original network, or the original directory services. So here's a search exploit looking on some SMB vulnerabilities. So like we showed before when we were doing our vulnerability detection, or that one day we did the walkthrough there, one of those boxes that we did the search exploit. So you can see they're searching SMB, and then we can see all the different vulnerabilities related to SMB. And you can see on here too, SMB is not only limited to Mac OS. If you can set up SMB on Linux and Unix type systems, so you're able to connect, creating Windows type shares. It's a little more user friendly to interact with a Windows environment when you set up these kind of shares on Linux systems. So you can see some of these different vulnerabilities related to that. So okay, so yeah, we kind of covered that before the exploit and search exploit, but there's a manual there that you can look through. There's some other tools. I have to look some up. There's some other tools that are similar to search exploit that have recently come out that encompasses a little more things. I think there may be some written in Go and some other languages that do something similar. So one of the most common used SMB exploits in recent times is the Eternal Blue exploit, which was leaked. So this was leaked by some of the NSA exploits that were being used. These got leaked, so they got out in the public, and so this has been some very popular exploits. The Eternal Blue is kind of like the more modern version of the MS 067 vulnerability that used to exist, that's vulnerable in like Windows XP and 2000. So this exploit's been used in ransomware such as WannaCry and Mieta. This exploit has been ported to many different tools, including Metasploit. And a lot of these exploits out there, there's people, if not the creator of the exploit, will port them over to Metasploit. Then there's other people that will go out there and port these over to work on Metasploit, which makes it a lot easier to manage. And Metasploit originally, the Metasploit framework was created originally to manage exploits. It was just a way to index and keep up with exploits, and then it just kind of evolved into an exploit framework, so you could launch your exploits from there. And so here shows an example of Eternal Blue being used. It shows the different options with it. So there's some systems that are vulnerable in VLabs that you can play around with this on. And one of the things is too, if you're going through the OSCP, make sure to learn how to use scripts to exploit and other methods besides just Metasploit. But that being said too, is understand how to use Metasploit, because once you're out doing this professionally, then you're going to use whatever works best and whatever's quickest. You want to get, just like using a vulnerability scanner, you want to be able to do more in less time and spend more time on the areas that need more time and attention. So DNS cache poisoning. So DNS cache poisoning is another popular attack leveraged by threat actors, and I really love the way this content is written. Threat actors. I'm kind of part of a advocate for the hacking is not a crime, and so we're part of that organization is to let people know that not all hacking is bad. If you're using it illegally, it is, but it's like, woodworking or art, it's not illegal. It's a craft, but it's like some things you can do illegal things with it. I mean, if you're an artist, you can make, counterfeit money. So, not artists or criminals, but we're trying to there's a lot of people out there. Chris Roberts has been a long time person that's been trying to change the views of the term hacker, get people to use other things. And that's why the term ethical hacker came about, because most people saw it as negative. So it really should add the negative connotation to negative acts like threat actor or malicious hacker in that sense. But I'll get off my soapbox and back to lecture. So, so yeah, they can use this poisoning to involve manipulation of DNS resolvers and cache. So with this, you can actually redirect someone to a bogus website or a malicious website, or, on your network, you can, redirect them to the site. And there's some simple things like if you can hack a system, you could even change like the host file and redirect people to different websites and stuff too. So it's something that can be done, not exactly the DNS cache poisoning, but it's a similar attack. But this is where like some of your attacks, like the evil twin attacks, sometimes they'll use things like DNS cache poisoning to redirect you to a malicious site. So maybe you're in your local coffee shop having a coffee and someone sets an evil twin attack up. Not only do they use something like Ssl Strip to do a man-in-the-middle attack and be able to read all your clear text communications, they can do DNS poisoning and lead you, set up some fake sites to lead, they could create some fake banking websites. And you could take your popular sites like Bank of America, Capital One, and create fake sites and redirect people to those sites. And, you make an exact clone of that. You can harvest credentials that way. So that's really the dangers of being able to chain together two different attacks like that, the DNS cache poisoning and the evil twin attack. And so they're showing kind of steps to pull off this attack. So the attacker corrupts the data of the DNS server cache, impersonates the website. So they're impersonating the website before the attacker executes the DNS poisoning. DNS server successfully resolve the IP address to the correct address by using NSLOOKUP command. So NSLOOKUP, this is kind of a good recon tool when you're doing pen tests. You can look up the different name servers for a domain. This is really good when you're doing external pen tests. You can find some other targets. So this says a DNS resolution before DNS cache poisoning attack. And in step 2, the attacker executes DNS poisoning attack. The DNS server resolves the domain name to the IP address of the attacker. So like I said, you can even do this. If you get access to a system, you can change a host file and get someone to go somewhere else. Back in my sysadmin days, people would play jokes and send people to different websites just by going in and changing the host file. And so the DNS server replies with IP address of the attacker system. The victim sends HTTP GET to the attacker system, and the attacker impersonates the domain name. And so DNS cache poisoning attacks also combine elements of social engineering to manipulate victims into downloading malware or ask the victim to enter sensitive data into forms. So like your fake bank website. And so here's kind of a tip to configure. It says you can configure your DNS service to rely on as little possible on trust relationships with other DNS servers in order to mitigate DNS cache poisoning attacks. DNS server using bind 9.5.0 and higher provide features that help DNS cache poisoning attacks to help prevent. These are some different tips on there on how to prevent the attacks. This class is attacking, is also ethical hacking and system defense, but we really don't focus a lot on system defense, but our course content does contain that, and it's contained in the Pentest Plus. And to that effect, one of the things about being a really good effective pen tester is learn how to mitigate these findings. The more you can help someone out with steps on to how to remediate those exploits, the better pen tester you're going to be. So that sometimes means learning more of the blue team side, learning more of the defense stuff. So Snmp is a protocol organized to manage network services. So a lot of your monitoring software uses Snmp. So this will monitor the health of the system. So this lets you know if a system's up, if the state changes. So it's just kind of a way to manage systems. And so, different monitoring systems, you can have Snmp set up where you can see if the system's down. You get into more of the vendor specific stuff, like your server manufacturers will have Snmp where it can tell you, different things about, the temperature of a server and, just different things related to, how it's operating. So you're able to possibly get things, fixed before they break. If you have a hard drive failing, information on the hard drive can be valuable, so you're not losing drives. But a lot of times people are using RAID or some kind of redundancy so they don't lose it, or they're clustering, but still it's good to have that health information. So there are several different versions of this protocol. So there's version 2C, version 3. Version 2C uses community strings, which are passwords that are applied to network devices, allow administrator access to the device in two ways: by providing read-only or write access. So your public key usually gives read-only access. You're able to see those, the communications but then the private usually lets you write to that. So if you're configuring your monitoring stuff on your network, you want to set up just like read-only, so you can only read this, so someone can't go in there and change things without it actually being remediated, or the problem with that system being resolved. And so that you can brute force these community strings. And a lot of times people use the default community strings, and so you can go out and find lists of those and actually get into the system and change stuff or gain information. One of the biggest things is just collecting information on the system. So the more information you have, it's almost like doing doing your, it's part of your enumeration. So you're getting information on that system. It's the biggest challenge with Snmp when you can't configure Snmp version 3. I've been so removed from configuring Snmp myself. It's all been since January 2004. It's all been, through security or pen testing related activities. So let's see. So Snmp version 3 uses usernames and passwords. So this is even better. So it's more secure than the previous versions, where all you need to know is just like this single key or whatever, the community string. So lesson 3, you learned how to use Nmap scanner. So we used Nmap, so you can go through here and you can use some of these NSE scripts to look on different look for different vulnerabilities within Snmp. And so we see here that you're searching the scripts directory to look for different Snmp scripts. So you can run these. This one will like brute force the community strings to try to get in, and so to get information. So the iOS configuration, this is related to your Cisco device. It was the original iOS, not to be confused with the operating system for the Apple phones. And you get netstat information. So a lot of different information you can collect from there. So in addition to check NSE scripts, you can also use the Snmp check tool to perform an Snmp walk in order to gather information for Snmp. Okay, so always change passwords. As best practices, you should always limit Snmp access to only trust hosts and block UDP port 161 to any untrusted systems. So that's another thing a lot of times that people don't practice is, with your firewall ports, setting up your firewalls in your systems, you can allow access to certain systems. So doesn't mean you have to turn off Snmp, just means that you limit the access to who's getting to port 161, only the trusted systems that are mentioned here. So another best practices is to use Snmp version 3 instead of older versions. So SMTP, this is your simple mail transfer protocol used for your mail servers, and this can be used to exploit systems if it's insecure. Let's see, before you can understand how to exploit email vulnerabilities such as SMTP-based vulnerabilities, you must familiarize yourself with the standard TCP ports. So TCP port 25 is a default port for non-encrypted communications. And so you see down here, port 993 is for encrypted protocol, the encrypted port version of the protocol. And so the 465 is deprecated in favor of Start TLS. So this is using TLS for communication, the Start TLS. TCP port 587 is secure SMTP for encrypted communications. And so the Start TLS can also be used over TCP port 25. So it's kind of a good idea to probably, encrypt, all of any of your communications through that, or not use port 25. Port 110 is used by POP3 communications, a lot of your web-based emails. 995 is for POP3 encrypted communications, and 143 is for IMAP. So SMTP open relays. So with this, you can actually send messages through open relays. So you have to, so here we see that they're running a Nmap script to test for open relays. And so we see that it is vulnerable to open relays. So here's some different commands. So when you're initiating your conversation with the SMTP server, you start with hello, which is -1L, and this command is followed by IP address for simple hello. So you just see, you put an IP address, and and then LO is used to initiate conversation with an extended SMTP. It actually kind of sounds kind of British, hello. And this command is used the same way hello command. Start TLS starts a transport layer. So receipt used to denote the email address of the recipient. Data is used to initiate the transfer of the contents of the email message. Reset is used to reset cancel email transmission. Mail is used to denote the email address of the sender. And quit is used to close the connection. Help is used to display the help menu. Auth is used to authenticate to a client to the server. Verify is used to verify when users' email boxes exist. So you can verify that email exists. EXPN is used to request or expand a mailing list on a remote server. So we can kind of look here at a sample communication. So they're connecting on Telnet, and you can also use like Netcat to communicate with. I really prefer Netcat over Telnet. It's just kind of less cumbersome to exit out of than like using Telnet. And so you see where they're connecting. So they connected, and so we see that this is we get the domain name of the server, and we see it's running on Ubuntu, and they're using the postfix mail server. So they're verifying the system. So verify admin. So the admin account on there, let's see, it says receipt address rejected, username is unknown. So there's not an admin account on there. So they verify root. So this verify command is verifying the user email boxes. So if you're trying to do, social engineering, and you're going to send a phishing email, so you want to make sure you've got a valid email address that you can send to, and it'd be a good idea to have a valid email address to send from. So we see that they verified root and also the account for Omar. Okay, so the SMTP Enum tool is installed by default in Kali, enables you to automate these information gathering steps. So anytime you can use a tool over doing these kind of things, and there's also too, when you're trying to get HTTP headers, you can use Telnet, and it's a little cumbersome, but there's other easier tools. So it's good to understand the mechanics of how it works, but there's easier ways to do this. So here they're showing the SMTP Enum, user Enum tool. This kind of gives us the detail and the syntax on how it works. So we see here how they're using this, and so you can actually use like a users list. So we're actually testing for users from a list, or you can use individual users. So you see the difference here. For the users list is uppercase U, whereas for the individual users is lowercase u. So this makes it a lot easier because you're going through a testing. You want to be able to test as many accounts as you can as quickly as you can. You don't want to waste a lot of time. You want to spend time, testing and hacking stuff. And so here, so we're using, so they're actually testing the account against using Omar as the user. And so we verified it. And so here's the output of the file, the target count, worker process, target domain. So scan started, so this gives us the scan time. So we verified that. So we ran this little command and we're not having to go through and do the telnet and all the stuff we did before to get through here like that, using that. So, and always use, keep your eye on new tools. There's always something that comes out there that makes things easier. And so using known exploits for Smtp. So we're doing a search on Smtp. And so we see a list of different exploits on here. And usually Metasploit has usually denial of service exploits. So make sure you're careful not to use those. I've actually done that on Pentest before. Was too excited that the server was vulnerable and I was looking for the exploit and didn't pay attention to the DOS, the denial of service. So I ended up rebooting the server, which was okay. Luckily, the customer was really understandable. So there's different, exploits in here based on different email systems. So Udura email. So we see a lot of different email systems. IP switch, I haven't heard that one in a long time. I don't know if that one still exists or not, still being used. So there's different systems. So you need to know, like when you're pulling this information back here and it showed you if you can get the email information from when you're doing your test. Some of these other ones may give you, so if you're getting the information on the mail server you're using, then you can find the exploits based on that particular mail system. And so FTP exploits. FTP, you really want it to avoid anyway. It's used to transfer files, but it transfers in clear text. So someone could intercept your passwords, usernames and passwords. Back in the days of hubs, when people didn't use switched networks, it was easier for someone in the network to run a sniffer and capture that traffic. It's a little more trickier these days. And, routers and switches, someone that's monitoring those sees the traffic being transferred back and forth so they can get your usernames and passwords from that. So you want to be careful with FTP. You want to use like secure FTP or SSH, which was the SCP, secure copy uses SSH. And so here it shows that they're doing the service scan against this server. So we could have done this exactly right against on the specific port. We know FTP is installed. We could have specifically picked port 21. So there's 2 ports open on this system. One is VSFTP, and then we have OpenSSH enabled, and we see the versions of those. So knowing the versions, we're able to pick, exploits based on that. And so they're using the auxiliary scanner for anonymous FTP. So anonymous FTP will allow you access to the system without knowing the password. So basically for your username, you put an email address. Doesn't even have to be your email address, and then just any password or no password at all. And it'll take it and log you in. And if they got their permissions set correctly, you're not going to get very far. But if they don't have their file permissions and directory permissions set correctly, then you're possibly, you can upload malicious files, you can get access to files in the system that you shouldn't have access to. So we see that they've got anonymous read access, which in some cases you may think, that's bad because I can't upload or I can't write, upload to it or, write or modify stuff, but you can still read this information. If they've got sensitive information on there, then you can still read it. So that's a risk right there. And so you can use Metasploit to test that out. There's a Metasploit, well, we just actually use Metasploit. Yeah, I don't know. But yeah, Metasploit makes that easier. You can also, there's also a NSE script for Nmap that you can run. And so pass the hash attacks. So the information we got from our responder output, our NVA, where we intercepted the landman, the LLMNR, or Netbios stuff, we can use those hashes. And also, if you get access to the SAM database, you can pull information from there on local accounts. So Microsoft has also a suite of security protocols for authentication called NT Land Manager or NTLM. And version 2 is the older, so you don't want to be using version 1. So NTLM version 2 is a newer version of it. Since 2000, Microsoft has used Kerberos in Windows domains. However, NTLM may still be used in client authentication to a server via IP address or client authentication to a server in a different Active Directory. So some of these older protocols are used for backwards compatibility. Maybe there's some older systems that can't be updated, and that's why these are used sometimes. So, okay, go back here and read some of these. Someone said, is there a reason why DOS or DDoS are exempt from Pentest? Like if you're trying to show them vulnerabilities, wouldn't it be considered one? Wouldn't that be something? Yeah, it would be it would be good to know the vulnerabilities. And that's where some of your vulnerability scanners are good, as well as some of the auxiliary modules for Metasploit. You can run those and find out if it's vulnerable to denial of service. The reason they don't want denial of service done is they're running a business. They don't want their servers crashed. And as you get into pen testing, one of the things you'll find out is it's really hard to get people on board to test the systems, because either they've had a bad experience or they heard you can crash their systems. So they're worried about that. So that's the biggest thing itself. So ideally, if it's vulnerable to denial of service, usually your vulnerability scanners are going to pick up on that, or some other tools like some of your auxiliary scanners and Metasploit. So if you see those in there, you can check for the vulnerability. So if you see a DOS exploit, you can, if it has the check function in Metasploit, then you can just do a check to see if it's vulnerable. And actually on Pentest, if we've accidentally took down a system, we actually put that in our report, because doing vulnerability scans and port scans shouldn't really take down systems. That means that, they need to upgrade their hardware or their software operating system to newer versions. Can't always protect them. And can't you create a queue for people when buying stuff? I don't know if it's fun, prevents network crashes. Yeah, you could create some kind of control the network traffic or whatever, set your settings to try to prevent some of the crashes, like for web stuff. But then you have a lot of you have like Akamai and I think Cloudflare too offer products that protect against denial of service. So a lot of people are using those type of systems, and some of those serve dual purpose. Some of them are web application firewalls too. And so Ria says that you can use that's used in video game servers to prevent crashes. I wouldn't say it's David says I wouldn't say it's off limits, but they're really required planning. Yeah, you can do that sometimes. And sometimes smart companies will test things. They want to, because even in development, sometimes they'll run load testing software to test to see if it can handle the load. So it serves dual purpose there. When you're doing load testing, you can kind of see the option for denial of service. It doesn't always necessarily mean you're just sending network traffic. It could be application traffic too. And so to pass the hash, back to that. So since Windows 2000, Microsoft has used Kerberos in Windows domains. However, NTLM may still be used. So that's still used a lot of times, for your backwards compatibility. And so what is the pass the hash attack? So because password hashes cannot be reversed, instead of trying to figure them out, what the user's password is, an attacker can just use the password hash to connect to the compromised system. So yeah, you can do that. Sometimes it's faster than trying to, if you got long, complex passwords, it may be difficult to crack if you don't have like a really heavy duty GPU hash cracking system. That may be more difficult. So be able to do that. So your responder relays hashes. Also your crack map exec and some of the impact tools can be used to pass the hash. So Kerberos and LDAP-based attacks. So Kerberos is an authentication protocol defined by RFC 4120 that has been used by Windows for several years. Kerberos is also used by numerous applications in other operating systems. So yeah, Kerberos was kind of used in some other Unix-based servers and stuff before Microsoft adopted it. So that technology was out there. And so we'll probably see this attack here listed pretty soon, but Kerberosing is one of the attacks. And we actually had the honor of having Tim Medine do a talk for Pwn School back in December. And he's a SANS instructor and the creator of Kerberosing. So there's three basic elements to Kerberos. So you have the client, the server, and the key distribution center, the KDC, which the KDC manages the tickets. So here we see a diagram of how Kerberos works. Step one, client sends a request to the KDC. Step two, the authentication server sends a session key and ticket granting ticket that is used to verify the identity. Step three, the client sends the TGT to the ticket granting server. Step four, the ticket granting server generates and sends a ticket to the client. Step five, the client presents the ticket to the server. Step six, the server grants access to the client. So learning anything about security or how to hack things is, going through like they show us here on how Kerberos works. So understanding the steps and how something works and figuring out how to, exploit that, finding the vulnerability to exploit that flow of traffic there. Active Directory uses LDAP as an access protocol. The Windows LDAP implementation supports Kerberos authentication. LDAP uses inverted tree hierarchy structure called directory information tree. In LDAP, every entry has defined position. The distinguished name represents the full path of the entry. One of the most common attacks in Kerberos is the golden ticket attack. An attacker can manipulate Kerberos tickets based on available hashes by compromising a vulnerable system, obtaining the local user credentials and the password hashes. If the system is connected to a domain, the attacker can identify a Kerberos TGT password hash to get the golden ticket. So here's a tip. Empire is a tool that can be used to perform golden ticket and many other types of attacks. Empire is basically a post-exploitation framework, including a pure PowerShell Windows agent and a Python agent. So these are very popular tools, and fortunately Empire has been maintained by BC Security, because once PowerShell went to version 3.0 and cut out support for 2.7, then the creators and maintainers of PowerShell Empire quit supporting it. So BC Security took it over, and they've been maintaining it and adding features to it. So fortunately, we still have that tool to use. So with PowerShell, with Empire, you can run PowerShell agents without the need to use the PowerShell exe. You can download Empire and access several demonstrations, presentations, and documentations at PowerShell Empire. And so example 5-13 shows the Empire Mimikatz golden ticket module, which can be used to perform a golden ticket attack when the Empire Mimikatz golden ticket module is run against the compromised system. The golden ticket is established for the user to set using the KBRTGT password hash. So here we show them using that module for the Mimikatz golden ticket attack. So they're looking at the options here. So that just shows some of the different options to output that ticket for that attack. A similar attack is Kerberos Silver Ticket. Silver tickets are forged service tickets for a given service on a particular server. The Windows Common Internet File System allows you to, or CIFS allows you to access files on a particular server, and host service allows you to execute scheduled tasks.exe, or Windows Management Instrumentation, WMI, on a given server. In order to create a silver ticket, you need the system account ending in $0. So if you run a responder and you capture hashes, then you will see the system accounts. And like when we were doing that exploit walkthrough the other day, when we did the echo host, and it showed that name. So we also saw that we're running as that system. So we had that $, the security identifier, the SID for the domain, the fully qualified domain name, and the given service. For example, SIFs hosts, you can use the tools such as Empire to get the relevant information from a Mimikatz dump for a compromised system. Another weakness in Kerberos implementations is use of unconstrained Kerberos delegation. Kerberos delegation is a feature that allows an application to reuse the end user credentials to access resources hosted on a different server. Typically, you should allow Kerberos delegation only if the application server is ultimately trusted. However, this could have negative security consequences if abused, and Kerberos delegation is therefore not enabled by Active Directory. So understanding the man-in-the-middle attacks. So in a man-in-the-middle attack, an attacker places him or herself in between two devices or individuals that communicate over eavesdropping or manipulate the data transfer. Man-in-the-middle attacks can happen at layer 2 or 3. So layer 5 demonstrates a man-in-the-middle attack. And this is used a lot in your evil twin attacks. So you can use like Ssl stripping and get clear text information. So you can see the attacker here, and you can see the flow of the attack. In understanding Arp spoofing and Arp cache poisoning, Arp cache poisoning, known as Arp spoofing, is an example of an attack that leads to man-in-the-middle scenario. And Arp spoofing attack can target hosts, switches, routers connected to a layer 2 network by poisoning Arp cache of systems connected to the subnet by intercepting traffic intended for other hosts and subnets. In figure 5-5, the attacker spoofs layer 2 MAC addresses to make the victims believe the layer 2 access is the layer 2 address of the default gateway. The packets are supposed to go to the default gateway for it to the switch to the layer 2 address of the attacker on the same network. The attacker can forward the IP packets to the correct destination in order to allow the access to the client. So this makes it looks like the connectivity is still there. So the common mitigation Arp poisoning attacks is to use dynamic address resolution protocol inspection on switches to prevent spoofing of layer 2 addresses. Another example of a layer 2 man-in-the-middle attack is to place a switch on the network and manipulate spanning tree protocol to become the root switch. And so this is done a lot of time with your networks sniffers. They'll use the spanning tree protocol to set up a sniffer to monitor traffic. And you know how we're talking about some of the Ssl strip to strip out the SSL or TLS information to see clear text information. There's some network tools that they do this to be able to monitor the network traffic to make sure there's nothing malicious in there. So it's actually used for actual good too as well. So an attacker can carry out a man-in-the-middle attack at layer 3 by placing a router on the network, then tricking the other router into believing that the new router has a better path. It is also possible to perform man-in-the-middle attack by compromising the victim system and installing malware that can intercept the packets sent to the victim. The malware can capture the packets. They are encrypted if the victims are using SSL, TLS, or HTTPS or other mechanism. An attack tool called Ssl Strip utilizes the man-in-the-middle functionality to transparently look at HTTP traffic, hijack it, and return non-encrypted HTTP links to the user in the response. This tool was created by a researcher called Moxie Marlinspike. You can download it from this URL. Only thing is with some of the Getting it to work on Kali Linux on the newer versions gets a little tougher because with some of the updated software, getting away from the older versions of Python makes it difficult. There's been a lot of difficulties with some of the new tools or running tools on the newer versions of Kali Linux, thanks to the deprecation of Python 2.7. You can still run it. You'd have to find the older tools and set up your environment to get it to work. Sometimes a good reason to keep VMs around of older versions of Kali Linux. So here's some steps on securing your infrastructure. So downgrade attacks. So this is getting into like your Poodle, your padding Oracle downgrade attacks. So a downgrade attack, an attacker forces a system to favor weak encryption protocols or hashing algorithms to be susceptible to other vulnerabilities. An example of a downgrade vulnerability and attack is the padding Oracle on downgraded legacy encryption vulnerability, and OpenSSL, which allowed the attacker to negotiate the use of lower version TLS between the client and the server. You can find out more information along this link. So these are some of the things that you do as a pen tester that is not fun. So when you run your Nessus scans or your Nexpo scans and you find out that it's vulnerable to Poodle or running some different weak encryption methods, then you have to validate those. So you go through and run your SSL eyes, SSL scan, and some other tools to validate the versions of encryption and different encryption keys and protocols and all this to validate that. So this is one of the processes. It gets kind of boring because you're going to find a lot of this on the network. A lot of your more advanced pen testing companies, they leave this to the vulnerability scan. So they'll list what was found in the vulnerability scan and not go through a lot of effort, you know, validating every single IP address to make sure, you know, validate all the IP addresses and make sure they're all vulnerable. Typically you find that it's going to be, but you know, over my career, everywhere I've worked, we've had to validate that stuff, and it's really can be time consuming, and it's the least fun part of the pen test. Some pen testing firms are focused on, you know, things that are exploitable. So if there's something that comes back TLS or SSL related, some kind of encryption problem that can be exploited, then of course you go for it. But some of the other stuff is just listed in the report and not a lot of time spent on it. So that's one of the things you'll learn when you get out there, how to, you know, manually validate these different vulnerabilities, because because the vulnerability scanner found it, you have to find alternative methods. So Nmap, NSE scripts or options, SSL scan, SSLIs are a couple tools that you can download to run. And Qualys has their SSL labs, which is online. So if you have anything internet facing, you can plug in your domain name and it will come back, give you a report card showing all the vulnerabilities and certificate information, all that. So route manipulation attacks, kind of similar to some of the other attacks we mentioned earlier, like some ARP attack or cache attacks and stuff like that. Although different route manipulation attacks exist, one of the most common is Bgp hijacking. So this is going to be more of your WAN connectivity, your connection between sites and connections to the internet. And the BGP is the Border Gateway Protocol. I do remember that from my CCNA class that I took back in the day. And so BGP is a dynamic routing protocol used to route internet traffic. An attacker can launch a BGP hijacking attack, configuring or compromising the edge router to announce prefixes that are not been assigned to his or her organization. If malicious announcements contain a route that is more specific to legitimate advertisement or that.
Damn, Bill ain't here. Hold on for a minute.
Okay. I had to put someone on mute there. So again, past threat actors have leveraged unused prefixes for BGP hijacking in order to avoid attention from legitimate users, organizations. So this figure below shows a Bgp hijacking attack. And as we're going through all this stuff, I know some of this stuff seems maybe really technical to some, and some of these may be more familiar because you work in these areas, but you know, the thing with pen testing is learn the basics and you can learn other things as you go along. So if, you know, this is a concept that's difficult to understand, then, you know, going up, doing some studying up on networking can be helpful. The Active Directory stuff, the different Kerberos attacks and stuff like that, study up on Active Directory. That's going to help you. And that's one of the things that's kind of on my list as a pen tester that I plan to do, is to go back, and I do from time to time, go back and restudy some things I've already been over. Maybe it's been a while since I really have done much with it. So it's always good to go back and refresh concepts that you've seen before and learn new ones. So understanding denial of service and distributed denial of service attacks. So DOS and DDoS attacks have been around for quite some time. There have been heightened awareness of them over the past few years. DOS attacks can generally be divided into three categories: direct, reflected, and application. So a direct DOS attack occurs when the source of the attack generates packets, regardless of protocol, application, or so on, that are sent directly to the victim. So this could be web, you know, different types of protocols on that system that they're attacking. Most of the stuff on the internet is going to be web-based protocols. So that's, you're going to see a lot of that. I mean, you can see use other protocols as well. In 5.7, the attacker launches a direct DOS attack against a web server. The victim by sending numerous TCP send packets. This type of packet is aimed at flooding the victim with overwhelming number of packets in order to oversaturate its connection between connection bandwidth or deplete the target's system resources. This type of attack is also known as a send flood attack. Cyber criminals can use DDoS attacks to produce added cost for the victim when victim is using cloud services. In most cases, when you use cloud services such as Amazon, AWS, Microsoft Azure, DigitalOcean, you pay per usage. So attackers may launch a DDoS and cause you to pay more for usage and resources. Another type of DOS attack involves exploiting vulnerabilities as buffer overflows, such to cause a server or even network infrastructure device to crash, subsequently causing denial of service condition. Many attackers use botnets to launch DDoS attacks. A botnet is a collection of compromised machines that the attacker can manipulate from a command and control, also referred to as CNC or C2 system, to participate in a DDoS attack. And they can send spam emails, perform other illicit activities. Figure 5.8 shows how an attacker may cause a botnet to launch a DDoS attack. The botnet is composed of compromised user endpoints, laptops, home wireless routers, and Internet of Things devices, such as IP cameras. So this gives you the example of the botnet. And so that's really some of the serious flaws with some of the IoT stuff that came out with hard-coded credentials or not secure. This allows attackers to use them. So this is, and you know, IoT devices and some of these cameras and stuff, people aren't really, you know, not something they're always checking on. Whereas if it's a server, they may notice the server utilization is up or something along that, or some malicious activity. So in figure 5.8, the attacker sends instructions to the C2, their command and control. Subsequently, the C2 sends instructions to the bots within the botnet to launch the DOS attack against the victim server. Reflected DDoS. With reflected DDoS, attackers send to sources spoof packets that appear to be from the victim, and then the sources become unwittingly participating in the DDoS attack by sending the response traffic back to the intended victim. UDP is often used as the transport mechanism in such attacks because it is more easily spoofed due to the lack of the three-way handshake. For example, the attacker decides he wants to attack a victim. He can send packets, for example, network time protocol requests to a source that thinks These packets are legitimate. The source responds to NTP request by sending a response to the victim who was not expecting NTP packets from the source. 5.9 illustrates the example of the reflected DOS attack. So in figure 5.9, the attacker sends a packet to host A. The source IP address of the victim's IP address and the destination IP address of the host A's IP address. Subsequently, host A sends an unwanted packet to the victim. The attacker continues to send these type of packets. Not only does host A flood the victim, but the victim might also reply with unnecessary packets, thus consuming bandwidth and resources. And so amplification DDoS attacks. An amplification attack is a form of reflected denial of service attack in which the response traffic is made up of packets that are much larger than those were initially sent by the attacker to the victim. An example of this type of attack is an attacker sending DNS queries to a DNS server configured as an open resolver. These DNS servers, open resolvers, reply with response much larger in packet size than initial packets. The end result is the victim's machine gets flooded with large packets for which it never actually issues queries. And so figure 5.10 shows the example. So network access control bypass. This is, shows here it can be done on endpoints, wired or wireless networks. And so there's interesting ways to bypass this. So sometimes you can use change the client agent or the user agent on your HTTP request. Sometimes you can imitate a mobile device. Maybe the internal network access system will have weaker authentication requirements or security requirements for mobile devices. So you could use a different user agent to make it look like your device is a mobile device. They can bypass that. So NAC technology is basically used to protect your system. In short, network access switch or wireless network access points can be configured to authenticate users, perform a security posture assessment. So these NACs also not only protect access to system enforces policy. So you see like your VPNs and some of your network devices, your guest wireless networks, sometimes will check, make sure you got antivirus, different security settings are in place before they let you on the system, on the network. So in addition, NAC devices can be used several detection techniques to detect endpoints trying to connect to the network. A NAC device intercepts Dhcp requests from endpoints. A broadcast listener is used to look for network traffic such as ARP request and Dhcp requests generated by endpoints. Several NAC solutions use client-based agents. So this is like the user agents that you can use there to perform endpoint security posture assessments before joining the network. In addition, some switches can be configured to send an Snmp trap to the new MAC address that is registered with certain switch port and to trigger the NAC process. NAC implementations allow specific nodes such as printers, phones, video conference equipment to join the network by using a whitelist of MAC addresses corresponding to the devices. So if you're able to spoof a MAC address to one of these devices, you may be able to bypass it. So changing your MAC address is one way to do that. This process is known as MAC authentication or MAC authentication bypass. So the network administrator can pre-configure or manually change these levels. For example, a device accessing from a specific VLAN, for example, VLAN 88 must manually be predefined for a specific port by an administrator. Making deployment of dynamic network policy across multiple ports using port security is extremely difficult to maintain. Some of the NAC devices also would use like MAC address, like they said, the MAC address filtering. So what happens in a lot of companies, sometimes you've got someone coming into your office from another office. their MAC address is not on the network, security gets cumbersome, and so they disable this on some ports. So if the MAC address filtering is not in place, then anyone can get on the network. And like I said, you can also spoof a MAC address. So they're showing right here, spoof MAC address to get on. VLAN hopping on the set. One way to identify a VLAN is to say that all devices on the same LAN have a common layer 3 IP network address, and they are also located in the same layer 2 broadcast domain. A virtual LAN in another name for a layer 2 broadcast domain. A VLAN is controlled by a switch. The switch also controls which ports are associated with which VLANs. Figure 512 in the switches are in their default configuration, and the ports by default are assigned to VLAN 1, which means all the devices, including 2 users and 1 router, are on the same broadcast domain or VLAN. So as you start adding hundreds of users, you may want to separate groups of users into different subnets associated individual VLANs. To do this, you assign switch ports to the VLAN, and then the device connects to specific ports. As a member of the VLAN, hopefully all the devices that connect to the switch ports that are assigned to given VLAN also have a common IP address configured so that they can communicate with other devices on the same VLAN. Often, dynamic host part DHCP is used to assign IP addresses from a common subnet range to a device on a given VLAN. One of the problems with having 2 users in the same VLAN but not having the same physical switch is how switch 1 tells switch 2 to broadcast or unicast frame is supposed to be for VLAN 10. The solution is simple. For connections between 2 switches that contain ports in the VLAN that exist both switches, you call the tag that identifies which LAN each frame belongs to. 802.1q is the standard protocol for tagging. The most critical piece of information for discussion is the tag, is the VLAN ID. So currently the 2 hosts in figure 512, host A and B, cannot communicate because they're in separate VLANs. The inner switch links between the switches are configured as trunks. A broadcast frame set from host A and received by switch 1 forwarded to frame over the tag belonging to VLAN 10. Switch 2 would also see the tag known as a broadcast associated with VLAN 10, remove the tag, forward the broadcast to all the other interfaces associated with the VLAN, which includes the switch port connected to the network. These 2 core components, access ports being accessed to a VLAN and a trunk being tagged the traffic so that a receiving switch knows the VLAN frame it belongs to, are core building blocks of the layer 2 switching, where VLANs can be extended beyond a single switch. So host A and B communicate with each other, and they communicate with other devices on the same VLAN, which also have the same IP subnet, but they cannot communicate with devices outside the local VLAN without the assistance of default gateways. A router could be implemented with 2 different access port connected to different access port that has been configured for a different VLAN with 2 physical interfaces and different IP addresses on each. The router could perform routing between these 2 VLANs. And so we're going to go ahead and skip ahead to this DHCP starvation attack and rogue DHCP servers. So most organizations run DHCP servers. This is a way to manage your IP addresses. Back in the old days, and actually before I even got into system admin work, at one time there weren't DHCP servers, and people would assign IP addresses to each server and desktop, and then that just got hard to manage. So the DHCP protocol allows you to add IP addresses to those systems. A lot of cases, companies were using static IPs for servers, but then a lot of companies went to using DHCP to assign the server IP addresses. And you can even set that to, you know, there's even a little more granular way of, you know, assigning IP addresses to certain servers and stuff like that. So you don't have to go physically touch each server to do that. So you could use, if you have a, you can, they're showing here that if you use a fake DHCP request, then you can redirect people to a different DHCP server. So this is kind of, you know, makes you think a little more of the DNS spoofing. And so the DHCP starving attack, you're basically just kind of, let's see, let's go back and look at the details of this. Okay, so they're showing a tool called Yersinia they use to create a rogue DHCP server and launch a DHCP starving and spoofing attack. So you learn more about Yersinia in the tools section. So as you're going through these different sections, they'll have some different links and stuff that you can read a little more on. And as you're going along, make sure, you know, these, doing the knowledge checks to make sure, you know, you're getting the concepts down before you get to your quizzes. So that is the end of the lecture tonight. So if anyone has any questions, then I can take those.